Ayan, magandang hapon sa ating lahat at maraming salamat sa mga manunood ngayong hapon. Nakatitiyak na may magkakaroon tayo napakagandang talakayan ngayong hapon dito sa ating Asian Literary Forum. So thank you very much for coming, and I would like to thank our viewers and our speakers and our actors for this afternoon's very exciting discussion in our latest installment of the Asian Literary Forum for 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝘁, UP Institute of Creative Writing. This is a yearly activity that we undertake so that Filipinos can have a better understanding of literature in Asia, of literature in other parts of Asia where we actually are situated in, so that we don't just focus on, for example, European or American literature. Historically, we've had not very much knowledge about the literature of our neighboring countries. So this is the purpose of the Asian Literary Forum, to introduce Filipinos to ideas on literature, to literary activities, events, literary issues in various parts of Asia. Last year, we had a very nice discussion about Japanese and Indonesian literature, and it also attracted a lot of questions, queries, and discussion. And today, I think we'll also have a similar exciting time this afternoon. So I won't make the introductions long. I will just explain the flow of our program for this afternoon. We have two speakers. The first speaker will finish his talk, and then we will have our actors, and then we will have our question and answer from the online viewers. After our first speaker, then we will have our second speaker, after which we will then have our reactors, and then speakers from questions from our online viewers. So I think that's how we are sort of adjusting our program this afternoon. And I'm very happy to start the program with our speaker on South Korean literature and South Korean issues in literature. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Alex Taek-Gwang Lee. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Ramon Guillermo from the Center of International Studies, and I'm also part of the Institute of Creative Writing. Right, so I would like to introduce Dr. Alex Taek-Gwang Lee. Alex Taek-Gwang Lee is a professor of cultural studies and a founding director of the Center for Technology and Humanities at Kyunghee University, Korea. He is a visiting professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy, Politics, and Ethics at the University of Brighton, UK. He served as an academic advisor for the Gwangju Biennial in 2017 and is a program manager for the Venice Biennial of Architecture in 2021. He is a board member of the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs and Asian Theories Network. He edited the third volume of The Idea of Communism and 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝘁 and Schizoanalysis Post-Media. He published articles in journals such as Telos, Deleuze and Guattari Studies and Philosophy Today, and chapters in the Bloomsbury Handbook of World Literature, Thinking with Animation, Liberalism and Democracy, and Balibar Wallerstein's Race Nation Class, Rereading and Dialogue for Our Time. So let's welcome Dr. Alex Taek-Gwang Lee in South Korean and East Asian literature. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you for a kind introduction, and then I'm very honored, to be invited to this lecture series. I'm really happy to see you all, and then saving time, and then just get in my talk directly. Yeah, actually, I can talk about the self-evidence of literature. What I mean, actually, lots of people believed we have literature, and then we read the literature, and then my idea is that that idea of literature as such is invented, by modernity or some modern world. We started to have the concept of literature. So in this sense, literature is not, self-explanatory. That means it's no self-evident. Several poems such as poetry, novels, essays are classified as literary works, but their historical origins are limited to specific temporal period and geographical territory, modern Europe. What I mean, actually, the literature is an invention, done by a European. The Charlson Ong clarifies in origins of modern Japanese literature. The literary writing was uncommon in Japan before the 20th century. Likewise, in other, Asian countries as well, More interestingly, it was through Natsume Soseki, is the one of the precursor in modern literature in Japan, theory of literature, that Japanese people recognized the new writing style as a literature. So Soseki actually, found out Japanese people didn't have any idea about literature when he introduced, the modern literature into Japanese context. So as this Japanese case shows, literature is not timeless and ahistorical, but a modern invention. The aesthetic respond to mass politics. That means that people, actually the advent of literature, we have, that means actually in the modern world, the mass, that means actually people. So which was described in the Victor Hugo, in his very, the romantic novel, the Notre Dame in Paris. That novel begins with that kind of description of mass, right? So there is no political literature, but literary politics, and the styles of writing as such is an ambiguous process of modernization. So for non-Europeans like us, there was a writing in general, but not literature in the contemporary sense. That means we had writing, before the introduction of so-called literature in our world. In theory of literature, Soseki confessed that, quote, what is called literature in the realm of Chinese classic and what is called literature in English must belong to different categories and cannot be subsumed under a single definition, unquote. He wrote this actually, the description in his theory of literature. So he found out, the difference between what he thought in the literature and English literature, What is this discrepancy? What is this discrepancy between Chinese classic and the English literary works Soseki came across when encountering modern literature in England? Soseki's term, bunkaku, in Japanese kanji, the translation of English word literature, had different implication from its English origin when it was introduced into Japanese usage. Even though actually today we have, this translation, bunhak in Korean pronunciation, in Japanese, they actually translate literature into bunkaku. Actually, this meaning is quite different from English meaning of literature. The translation of literature into Japanese has a singular cultural background deeply rooted in Japan's historical, linguistic, and literary development, as well as Soseki's explanation of his encounter with English literature. This is a kind of event. The Soseki went to England to learn English, and he found it's a strange, the invention, which was called literature. It's a totally different way of writing from what he learned in terms of Chinese classics. Is it because in Korea we have 글 in Korean, the word, it doesn't mean a literature. Literature is a 문학, means a kind of study of the writing, something like that. It already embraced this implication study. So this is what the Soseki pointed out. Not only in 19th century Japan, but even Europe, the modern meaning of the word literature as a body of written or printed works that are considered to have artistic or intellectual value is indeed different from its earlier etymological root. The word literature has evolved over time and its current meaning is distinct from its Latin origin. For example, the etymological genesis of the word literature in English was first found in 1779 in Samuel Johnson's Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. Is according to the Oxford Dictionary, explaining its meaning as literary writer's profession. That's what it was the first time that Samuel Johnson used this word to indicate the literary writer's profession. So literary writer's profession is literature. The etymological root of the word literature can be traced back sorry to the Latin word literatura, which initially referred to the writing formed with letters or written document. In ancient Rome, literatura was used to denote any written or inscribed material, including letters, legal documents, and other written records. Quite similar to what our ancestors used, before the advent of or the introduction of literature. It encompassed all forms of written communication. However, the meaning of literature began to evolve over the centuries. In the Middle Ages, it came to associate with formal learning and education, including a study of written works in classical the languages like Latin and Greek. In this context, literature started to be used in a more specialized sense, referring to scholarly or academic writing. In the Renaissance and subsequent periods, the term literature gradually shifted toward its modern sense, emphasizing artistic and intellectual expression through written or printed works. This terminological transformation influenced the growing appreciation for literary artistry, creativity, and aesthetic quality in written text. As a result, literature in modern sense came to encompass works of fiction, poetry, drama, essays, and other forms for creative expression, as well as critical analytical writing about this work. So this is very interesting because aesthetic invention is a literature originally meant, some kind of document in the, any kind of the shape of a text. But after, the invention of literature turned into some aesthetic, the creation, all right? So 𝗏𝗍𝗃 was not the only non-European writer who happened upon a meaning of literary difference. So actually, 𝗏𝗍𝗃 was not only non-European writer who happened upon a meaning of literature, the different prompt supplied by their conventional education. 𝗍𝗁𝘁, the first modern Korean novelist, also identified the gap between the traditional meaning of literature and its use in modern English. In 1916, he wrote that his meaning of 문학 is the Korean pronunciation of 문과구, could not be grasped by the traditional definition of letters, but identify with the Western concept of literature. Of course, 𝗏𝗍𝗃's theory of literature influenced 𝗍's understanding, 𝗍광수's understanding of literature, but 𝗍광수's reception of notion was slightly distinct from 𝗏𝗍𝗃's. He regarded literature as a pragmatic method, educating people through emotional satisfaction and contributing to a nation's society, whereas 𝗏𝗍𝗃 considered the modern genre of science of human mind. So that means that 𝗏𝗍𝗃's thought literature is kind of modern genre, a science of human mind. 𝗏𝗍𝗃 assumed that, quote, acquiescence of the common notion that, your acquaintance to the common notion that literature and science are opposite terms, unquote. But he actually insists that, there is no, the difference between science and literature or some kind of connection between science and literature. So 𝗏𝗍𝗃 emphasized the process of literary production as scientific method to appreciate human emotion, and further defined criticism as something like doctor's medical examination and teacher's evaluation of student exam. In this sense, for the 𝗏𝗍𝗃 literature is a kind of alternative, science of mind. the human mind. From this perspective, his theory of literature was no more than a psychological inquiry into literary experiences. Interestingly, he stated that, quote, when one isolated for observation a moment of consciousness from continuity of a particular conscious state, one can see that preceding psychological state begins to attenuate, while the portion to follow, by contrast, is gradually raised in distinctness through anticipation, unquote. Quite a phenomenological, okay, very philosophical, the investigation into the meaning of, the literature in 𝗍𝗍𝗃's, the theory of literature. Surprisingly, 𝗍𝗍𝗃 seemed to be developing the principal early behavioral theory here, quite scientific. For 𝗍𝗍𝗃, literature was thus a tool of scientific observation to understand human psychology and behavior through an analysis of consciousness. Putting a distinction between scientific truth and literary truth, he stated that, quote, because literary truth consists in truth of feeling attached to the represented object, this is merely to say that arousal is immediate, unquote. He believed that general aspect of this empirical scrutiny could be applied to the criticism of literary text. In 𝗍𝗍𝗃's sense, literature is one of various scientific methods to get into the complicated operation of the psyche. He further argued that, quote, as long as one has attained an artistic truth, the person viewing the piece has no need to be troubled by whether or not it demonstrates scientific truth, unquote. Meanwhile, 𝗍𝗁 regarded literature as a propaganda instrument of enlightenment to bring forth a modern man in the spirit of nationalism. What made decisive difference between 𝗍𝗍𝗃 and 이 was their attitude toward valid use of literary machine, despite sharing a common perception of literature as a modern product of Europe. 𝗍𝗁's experience of modern literature was its meaning after Japan's colonization of Korea. In 1912, he traveled to Japan to continue his education. He studied at several institutions, including Waseda University. During his time in Japan, he was exposed to Western literature and ideas which profoundly influenced his thinking. In this way, his literary career began to flourish during this time in Japan. It became associated with the new literature movement, which sought to modernize Korean literature by incorporating Western literary style and themes. 𝗍𝗁's reception of literature was nothing less than the expression of his passion toward modernization, and his approach was more political than scientific. In an apology for his collaboration with Japanese imperialism in 1948, he stressed that, quote, the only way to cultivate strength of a nation was through strengthening individuals and organizing them. And without this kind of collective strength, it must be impossible to realize independence, unquote. In this vein, literature was an ideological apparatus to mobilize collective strength for nation building. What is the implication of his understanding of literature? To some extent, 𝗍𝗍𝗃's scientific attitude to literature may seem more essentially modern than is. However, it is also possible that 𝗍𝗍𝗃's position was the result of a retreat from the politics inherent new way of writing. Karatani Gojin points out that 𝗍𝗍𝗃's question was, what is literature? And, quote, this was the very thing that made his passion to private. Unquote. Gojin's discussion of modern Japanese literature sheds light on how introduction of Western theory changed the writer's perspective on nature and brought forth modern systems. For him, quote, the emergence of a landscape in the third decade of Meiji period marked the condition of modern self, unquote. He continued to argue that, quote, we may legitimately use the psychological approach in dealing with writers who emerged after the third decade of Meiji period, but we must keep in mind that such an approach will not expose the condition which produced the science of psychology itself, unquote. The Gojin point is that psychology invented psychological literature, and the theory of a psyche is the origin of a subjective phenomena. Gojin's discussion of landscape centers on transformation of Japanese literary and cultural imagination during the modernization of Japan. He argues that there was a significant shift in how Japanese writers, artists, perceived and represented their surroundings. Traditionally, Japanese culture had a strong connection to nature. Nature was often portrayed as harmonious and integral part of human existence, with humans living in harmony with the natural world. This traditional view of nature was rooted in the classical Japanese aesthetic and literature. According to Gojin, with the advent of modernity and Western influence in Japan, there was a gradual shift from the traditional concept nature to a new concept landscape. Landscape in Gojin's interpretation is a more detached and aestheticized way of looking at environment. Landscape involves framing and representing the environment as a visually pleasing and open, picturesque entity. Gojin defines landscape as representing the inner life and as a symptom of a frustrated political practice such as people's rights movement and political nobles in those days. Resting on Freud, Gojin claims that birth of integrity in Japan marked modernization literature through, 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗹 is the unification of spoken and written language. This cultural reform aimed to, simplify and modernize the Japanese writing system and make it more accessible to, general population. The, 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗃 movement profoundly impacted Japanese literature, education, and communication. It made the written text more accessible to the broader readership and facilitated the spread of knowledge. Literary works, newspaper, and other written material began to use the vernacular style advocated by this movement. This 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗃 was part of a broader effort of transforming Japan into a modern nation during the Meiji era. Gojin's point is that Japanese modernization in the 19th century produced the psychological dimension of writing, and the conception of landscape in modern Japanese literature clarifies how its aesthetic inversion created a psychological self. All right. So if endorsing, the Gojin's discussion, then literature is not a universal concept writing either, but rather global theory by which its traditional territory writing dismantled and transformed into political movement. Lusun and Jose Rizal, to the earlier modern writer in China and the Philippines, can serve as another essential example to illustrate this premise. As in the case of Lusun and Rizal thought of literature as a vehicle for nationalism. For Lusun, literature had a critical role to play in saving nation from its various ills. He argued that literature should address the pressing issue of time, such as political corruption, social inequality, and the need for modernization. Literature as a reportage. The Chinese reformist agenda to save the nation through literature, which was made up through the Chinese literary revolution and new cultural movement, articulated his belief, Lusun's belief in literature as a means of national salvation. The core argument of Chinese literary revolution was articulated by 𝗩𝗏, a Chinese reformist and philosopher who studied at Columbia University under supervision of John Dewey. Rejecting Chinese classicism, 𝗩𝗏 argued living literature, quote, shall be written in the spoken tongue and shall truly represent the life and needs of the people. And classicism is no fitting epithet for the literature. It is a dead literature, a literature which persistently excludes the language of everyday conversation and is only vaguely intelligible to the classical train, the few, the aristocratic, the writing, but it's totally inaccessible to the vast number of the people, unquote. His assertion, reverberated among his contemporaries, including Lusun, 𝗩𝗏 actually influenced Lusun, and drawing on the aims of the movement led by 𝗩𝗏, Lusun advocated for the literary study rooted in realism. Similarly, the Rizal's concept of literature was deeply rooted in his passion to promote Filipino identity and independence from Spanish colonial rule, or to some point in modernization. Rizal, believed literature was crucial in awakening national consciousness and fighting for Philippine, modernity was independence. He saw literature as a powerful tool for conveying ideas, shaping public opinion, and inspiring social and political change. Rizal was a proponent of using the native Filipino language, particular Tagalog, to express Filipino identity. He was convinced that by writing in their language, the Filipino could assert their distinct cultural and national identity instead of being subsumed by Spanish colonial culture. For this reason, Rizal's literature was regarded as, quote, one of the catalysts for the Filipino, revolution, and his execution in 1896 for sedition was due in no small part to the scathing critique of the colonial apparatus contained therein, unquote. However, Rizal's literary resistance to colonialism was ambiguous. His novels demonstrated, quote, a certain skepticism toward the most violent response to colonial rule, unquote. This ambiguity does not mean Rizal was afraid to confront colonial authority directly. Rizal did not criticize revolution, but, quote, this revolution at this time for which the country was not yet prepared, unquote. Like his, intense reverence for, Western civilization, Rizal also sought an independent Philippine, nevertheless an enlightened, Spain. The idea of modern writing as literature perhaps led to Rizal's contradictory attitude. As a tool, literature was not only the coercion of a Western, straitjacket, but also a method to awaken, the national sentiment latent in the people, or some making people. More importantly, the latter was always already innate in the birth of literature as such, the aesthetic dimension of a sensible. In other words, the formation of a national sentiment is awareness of the multiplicity of the living world. As Jacques Rancière, classifies, the literature has distinctive quality and function by its autonomy. Literalness is actually Rancière's term. Rancière's term is a complex and the multifaceted, the beyond the mere storytelling and language use. As a modern way of writing, literature has, unique rules and principles distinguished from other forms of communication and expression. Its usage creates a self-containment outside range of everyday language, which is primarily instrumental, and literature does not aim to serve merely as a means for transmitting information. This is when we can, have some equal language within, that the literary writing. In this way, literariness is closely tied to an aesthetic experience. Rancière believed that literature invites reader to engage with text in a way that transcends, immediate practical concern. It encourages readers to contemplate and reflect upon the language, the construction of a meaning, and the emotion and ideas it evokes. Therefore, literature is about conveying a message and producing an aesthetic experience. Rancière suggests that literature has the power to disrupt established norms and conventional language and society, as we have seen in, the 𝗪𝗻𝗪 and the Guangsu and the Jose Rizal and the Lusun. It can challenge the conventional ways of thinking and seeing, subverting the familiar, prompting readers to question their assumption. This disruptive aspect of literariness is often associated with its potential to create new modes of thought and expression. Rancière also connects, and literariness to the broader realm of politics and emancipation. He believes that literature can play a role in challenging hierarchies and power structure by giving voice to marginalized perspective and disrupting established order of things. Accordingly, Rancière's theory of literature emphasizes the role of subjectivity in the reading process. He argues that literature, allows individuals to become active agent in constructing meaning rather than passive recipient of a, predefined message. This involved engagement with literature reflects his broader philosophical commitment to democracy and the idea that all individuals can think equally and contribute to society. For Rancière, literature is nothing less than the expressive incarnation of modern egalitarianism, the principle of absolute equality. More importantly, Rancière distinguished between letters and literature to elucidate these two concepts, different function and the characteristic within the relevant language and culture. So literature comes to exist when its aesthetic exercise is separate from letters, according to Rancière. letters in Rangse's, the terminology refer to the broader field of the written communication and intellectual discourse. It encompasses all formal written, expression, including essays, treatises, philosophical text, scientific papers, and any written communication that conveys information or ideas. Letters are often associated with the transmitting knowledge, exchange information, and the rational discourse that characterizes academic and intellectual pursuit, as I discussed in terms of, the Latin, meaning of literature. So literature aims to, provoke emotion. Meanwhile, stimulate the imagination and challenge, established norms and convention. It often resists, easy interpretation, encourage the reader to engage the text on multiple levels. So, from this, perspective, we can understand, the literature in the, non-Western world, So for Rangse, literature as such is a byproduct of a contradictory poetics. The poetic, regime of art. Literature initially functioned as an artistic regime, to have given rise to the national sentiment in the modern Asia. This change does not simply mean that literature provides a rationale of a nation for further, the construct, the image in the community, but rather, quote, literature had become a powerful machine of self-interpretation and self-poeticization of life, converting any escape of, the everyday life into a sign of history and any sign of history into a poetical element, unquote. So this poetical demand to frame the world's common experience was how the politics of literature attained its ontological condition. In Rangse's terminology, the concept of artistic regime refers to different ways in which society have historically organized and understood the relationship between art, politics, and perception. Rangse identifies several distinct, aesthetic regimes that have shaped production and repetition of art and aesthetic over time. These regimes are, characterized by specific assumption, practices, and social arrangement. And Rangse classified 3 regimes of art according to the different distribution of sensible: the ethical regime of art, the representative or poetic regime of art, and the aesthetic regime of art. So, okay, so I'm just skip this part. All right, so he actually, the classified in 3 regimes, the related to this invention of the literature. And that means actually he tried to explain the, different regime would produce, different aesthetic, sensible, So he tried to, define the meaning of politics because he said, literature as such is political. There is no distinction between political literature, apolitical literature. The invention of literature as such is what? Embrace that kind of absolute principle of equality. All right. That's why just if you read literature or you write literature, that means political, the action. So the politics of literature is conditioned by its own self-contradiction. This is what he said, because the literature necessarily, erase that sort of the mute speech. Actually, they must create a mute speech. Is like the unification between speech and the written language. The spoken language and written language. They must the evict kind of a spoken language from a written language. That is a mute speech according to Rangse. So the contradictory condition of literature, that means actually the tension between spoken language and the written language. To quote, the novelist writes for people who should not read the novel, unquote. This is a contradiction of literature. Novelists would write, the text for those who cannot read that text. This is actually, the primer scene of, literature in Asia, whereas in other, non-European country. For this reason, the politics of literature must push literature to its end. The suppression of literature is a political goal of literature as such. Lussun's and Rizal's revolutionary literature can be regarded as an example that reveals the contradiction within the politics of literature. Gojin, sees the aesthetic inversion of modern Japanese literature as a political regression, but against this view, literature as such, or literalness, might be the politics of literature. In this sense, literature has functioned as a global theory writing beyond its European origins and framed lived world, common experiences. Literature was not only a particular form of writing that emerged in the modern era, but its politics also created mute speech and mute letter of nation through the unification of spoken and written language. Suppose modernization that made today's world commenced with the birth of literature. In that case, the transition from this world to another world must begin with the politics of contradiction inherited in literature as a global theory. Thank you very much. This is what I prepare.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alex Taek-Gwang Lee. And I think many of our listeners are interested to ask questions. But I'll start off with our actors. I'll introduce them first, and then they will talk about their actions to your lecture. So I'm going to start with Charlson Ong. Charlson Ong is a writer and professor of creative writing at the University of the Philippines. He has published 4 collections of short fiction: Men of the East and Other Stories, Woman of Amkau and Other Stories, Conversion and Other Fictions, and Of That Country Now Speak and Other Stories, as well as 4 novels: An Embarrassment of Riches, Banyaga, A Song of War, Blue Angel / White Shadow, and White Lady / Black Christ. He has won several national awards for his fiction, including the Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards, the National Book Award, the Gawad Balagtas, and the Southeast Asia Right Award from Thai Royalty. He has also won a Filipino Academy for Motion Picture Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for Tanabata's Wife, which he wrote and co-directed. Our next, the following actor will be Assistant Professor Dominic 𝗩𝗁. Dominic's stories have appeared in the Trans-Pacific Literary Project, The Literary Apprentice, and Transit, an online journal. His first book of fiction, A Natural History of Empire, won the Critica Cultura / Ateneo Manila University Press First Book Prize and was a finalist for the Philippine National Book Award and the Madrigal Gonzalez Best First Book Award. So we start off our reactions with Professor Charlson Ong.
Good afternoon. Congratulations, Dr. Lee, for your presentation. There were many ideas that were presented. I'm not sure if I can wrap my head around all of them, but I will react to some that are closer to my own work. Well, certainly the arrival or the introduction of European literature, especially the novel, it's a catalyst to East Asia for change, for revolutionary ideas, and the concept of the eye, the eye even improves in the remembrance of past things. Nothing much happens except there is an eye who remembers. So the individual becomes central to things and eventually can become an agent of change. And not just a representation of some moral principle. So Rizal himself, read a lot. He was influenced by Dumas, the Count of Monte Cristo, and he, in writing his own books. So maybe some of the things I can react to is the idea of the kanji, of the kanji present, the use of the Han, Chinese characters throughout most of the history of East Asia, China, South Korea, and Japan. And for much of the history, they were, in a sense, united by that common spirit, most of it. In fact, the story of Sun Yat-sen in Japan communicated with his contemporaries, Japanese and Koreans, through the use of script. But again, towards the end of the 19th century, the literariness of the style, the olden style came under attack. Became, for many reformers, it was the root of all evil. Everything wrong was almost blamed on the literary kanji. But anyway, those days only a few, maybe 10% of the population could read or write. So everything was blamed on it to the extent that even the characters themselves were blamed. And at some point, I know that I think the Chinese authorities even thought of just getting rid of characters and using a Roman alphabet instead, like in Vietnam. And I think it was reportedly it was Stalin who advised Mao not to do that. Yeah, so he did something good. So it never happened, but then the simplification process has continued, and now the characters used in China, in Taiwan, in Korea, and in Japan are very different because of the simplification project. Now, in our case, the modernist idea is always to annotate the classics. And in our case, our classics, especially to the Ilustrado, people like Rizal were educated then, were Greco-Roman, were Latin. That's why Rizal, in his own novel, Nodi Me Tangere, he uses Latin as a title. I think he was referring to a higher, or in a sense, a superior language, universal, not Spanish. And so those were our classics. Our painter, Panduna, painted this Roman scene. It's a classic now. It's Polarium, the gladiator being dragged out of the scene. And a lot of people have wanted to interpret it as some kind of nationalist painting. Of course, it's not. It's about the gladiator being extracted. So our classics, to them, were Latin, that educated class. So before and a lot of Filipinos then had to listen to Latin every day when they attended Mass, because the Mass was in Latin and no one understood what was being said. Just had to sit there and listen to all of that, like classic Chinese. And then so before he became a novelist, Rizal went to London, to the British Museum Library, and annotated Morga. Antonio de Morga, who wrote in 1609, he published Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, a book on the Philippines. He was here for many years and wrote about the Philippines then. So Rizal decided that Morga got a lot of it wrong. So he went there, he read, and then he used other sources and annotated, commented on maybe the landscaping of Morga, and said he got it wrong and all that. So he was now intervening as a colonial subject, now wanting to be claiming now to be part of the imagining of the colony, reinventing it, imagining it, because Morga was the outsider, was landscaping, playing now that's native born, you should know better. But of course, Rizal's larger project was the Perdido Eden. He wanted to imagine a lost paradise. But before the quest came, there was a kingdom existing that worked, that was glorious and all that. Of course, later today, the archaeology would not support much of it. But there were polities. There were places in Manila, in small chief towns. But anyway, it was a political project. it's a political project that despite, he was the father of many things. It's a rational, and it's a globalist of rational. He did a lot of scientific work. But then he also had this project that we might consider myth-making, creating that it was political. So he wrote that, he annotated, and when he wrote his novels, it was pretty realistic. So it was as socially realistic as it could be during that time. So he had these two projects that were both political, and one involved a bit of myth-making, and one was more being socially realistic. So that was our classic. That was his reaction to the classicism of our time, which was probably more than one of the first books written about the colony. So the other idea of literature being expressive and being scientific, personally, I think it affects me a bit now, because as a teacher of creative writing, creative writing has now become an industry. When I was in school, there were very few people enrolled in it, but now everyone wants to be a writer. Huge classes. And so since it's now in the academe, it has to wear academic robes. So when the student has to graduate, then he has to write, he or she has to write a thesis. The thesis is creative, but then now they have to, since it's academic, they have to critique themselves. So they have to write these critics about their own work, which very often doesn't work. It's a very strange thing that happens, and of course, as a reader, you tend to see more what's going on than the writer herself, who might not want to discuss certain things. And then I think it becomes even stranger when the state gets involved. For instance, now, again, we have the National Artist Award, right? And also the National Artist Award. Awards are given, lifetime awards are given to people in the arts. So it's the usual cinema, architecture, and literature. But literature has always been the more controversial thing, because who then do you award? Only the people who, poets, novelists? How about the scholars? How about people who write on literature? So it's always been should they be considered scientists, right? National scientists instead? For instance, the late 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗹 was made national scientist for it's a political scientist historian, but his book on history is very much read, Roots of the Philippine Nation. But he was made national scientist because I think most of his supporters were in the social sciences. So in the arts, in the literature, it's always been very dicey. And then since it's a presidential award, technically, the president can get involved. So people go to the president and say they want this person to be national artist. And so if he agrees, like years ago, the president agreed because they gave it to a person, to a writer who used to write biographies of famous people. And so they had to invent a category called historical literature just to justify the award. And then later on, during the Arroyo period, it became a big again, a bigger issue because he wanted to award someone, and then everyone reacted, including the national artists, and there were petitions signed, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court to decide. So it ended up the court now deciding who would be a writer or artist. So once the state gets involved with accolades and money, then it becomes even murkier situation. So anyway, those are my initial thoughts, on the whole, on and your idea of the classicism and globalism part. Yeah, maybe later I will comment further. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Charlson. I think that's a good take on the question of classicism and its particular form in the Philippine context, right? So I think we can really think about that. And I think now we go to Dom to hear his reaction to Professor Lee's talk.
Oh, hello. Well, first I want to say congratulations on the talk. It was a very interesting talk with a lot of ideas. My response, I'll try to keep my response short also, just in case there are questions from the audience. So I'll enumerate them relatively quickly. But basically some of it builds on some of the things Sir Charlson brought up. But basically what I'm thinking about is, well, I was very much struck by, the description of literature as a global theory, and the way in which, it dismantles the traditional territory of writing. I think that's the way you put it, and transforms it into a political movement. So I was thinking about political movements. I was thinking about literature and political movements across, let's say, maritime Southeast Asia, for example. So that we expanded beyond, let's say, big figures, right? Big figures like Lu Xun, big figures like Jose Rizal. But then I'm thinking also of the movements to very explicitly reframe literature as a political act by, for example, well, in Indonesia, you would have Lekra. Malaysia, I'm not as familiar with. Maybe Dr. Cho can tell us, but I think Angkatan Sastrawan 50, who talked about Seni Utuk Masyarakat, or Art for Society. And then, of course, in the Philippines, you have, well, in Tagalog, for Filipino, you have Paksa. For English, you have the essays of S.D. Lopez. And so you have these, although they're not all the same, some are more Marxist, some are less so, but these are all like, they were all framed happening almost at the exact same time. There's a near simultaneity of experience where there were these discussions about the role of literature in political, like its engagement, its level of engagement with politics. Not to what extent should it be socially conscious, to what extent does it have to be more artful, more social, all of these things. I bring this up not just because it is very explicitly political, but I guess to leave for consideration that near simultaneity, and the fact that these discussions, these debates, sometimes violent fights, like in the case of Lekra and the 𝗩𝗁𝗶𝗄 writers, they were happening all at the same time. They were happening, and I think this kind of works alongside the claim that you were making about how literature is something invented, and perhaps you could say constantly invented, constantly reinvented in modernity in the last 100 or so years. And in line with that, I was thinking of, if we look into those debates again, like about stepping toward that kind of fraught field where it's no longer just no longer just the large figures like Lu Xun and Jose Rizal, both of whom have been, I would say, to build on what Sir Charlson was saying, incorporated in some way into, like, say, state constructions of what literature is or what literature is supposed to be. Rizal is taught in every high school. I'm not sure about Lu Xun in China and Taiwan, but I wouldn't be surprised if Lu Xun is taught in every high school, and that perhaps changes the relationship between the reader and Lu Xun and the reader and Rizal. Definitely in the Philippines, most people, at least, when they read Rizal, they just kind of get through it and then they forget about it after high school. I was thinking, like, if we step away from that and then move towards, let's say, these larger questions of issues of to tie together with the discussion Dr. Cho will give later, I think, questions of localization, questions of indigenization, right? So literature now being constantly reinvented, but its constant reinvention also involves in every society this context of this attempt to indigenize it, to localize it in some way, whether in terms of connecting it with the existing body of traditions, whether that's sastra or 𝗦𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁 or all of these different things, or at the same time, whether it's perhaps trying to connect the act of, let's say, storytelling or the act of poetic creation to older forms, indigenous forms, perhaps forms that weren't in the past considered as literature, right? But now that we have this new category being constantly reinvented in the modern age, how then do we reconceive, for example, the old epics in the Philippines? And so this, or the various folk traditions in Indonesia, right? So this is, I think those were essential parts of an ongoing process, really, an ongoing process of trying to create these literary traditions in these own countries and give literature a real kind of living tradition in this world, as compared to just like a very academic or even state-sponsored concept of literature. So I was thinking those were things to and I was thinking about when I was reading the work, and I think maybe could be points for further discussion as well. So yeah, so congratulations again, very interesting ideas. Yeah, that's it for now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, following on Dom's reaction, I think what Dr. Lee's lecture gives us is a kind of opening for a kind of theoretical genealogy of the category of literature in East Asia and Asia as a whole. So I think it's a way that we can come to a more historical grasp, even a theoretical grasp of what literature means to these different contexts. For example, in Tagalog, the word for literature is quite new. Invented only, I think, in the early 20th century. It's panitikan, and it comes from the word titik, which means letter. So it was closely tied to the notion of writing from the very beginning of its. But I think Dr. Shou has something to add here too, because I think she working in the area of translation from Chinese to Malay and English. I think some of the issues that Dr. Lee already aired about, about the complexity of these writing systems, how they're simplified, and then also Charlson's point about this. I think Dr. Shou can say something about this too. Yingxin, would you like to say something?
Sure. Thank you. Should I start my presentation or?
Just maybe you
just
can
respond
to Dr. Lee's.
Oh, okay.
I think because you have something interesting to say about that, right?
Right. A lot of things. I think it's such an insightful talk, really. And from the reactions from Charlson and Dominic, I think a lot of things for us to discuss, including the role of nationalism in reinventing the idea or the notion of literature in a modern sense. I think this is very much relatable in Malaysia as well, especially when we know that the Malay writers, they also opted for romanization of the Malay language from the Arabic script into a romanization. It is for it's also a question of modernity, and because it's but I think we
Yeah.
Could you read that, for the audience? It's quite a long question.
Yeah, I'll read the question, Dr. Lulu's question. In Southeast Asia, at least in the Philippines, where spoken and written languages are not quite unified, historically, nonetheless, Traditional literature and literary forms played a key role in the struggles for national liberation, although modern forms like the novel or the short story had their fair share in the struggles. Needless to say, this type of literature, especially of the oral kind, exists not only to function as artistic regime, inextricably linked, insistently and concretely as it is to everyday life, meaning it neither necessarily belongs narrowly to the ethical, representative, nor aesthetic regimes. Modern literature and literary forms, like Lu Xun and Rizal's works, help explain the power of traditional literature based on the assertion that the politics of literature is conditioned by its own self-contradiction. How might oral literature, which insists on locality, be a...
It's gone. All right. What I have is the Lulu's question. So
yeah. So that's the end of the question.
Yeah. So her point is that just 𝗏𝗪, according to 𝗏𝗪's classification of a different regime of the different regime of the art. That what actually 𝗏𝗪 said is according to 𝗏𝗪, in the regime, different regime would produce the different aesthetic experience. That means it doesn't mean that we can create experience. Experience is quite performative. That means different regime would let us to frame that experience, in certain aesthetic language. That is what 𝗏𝗪, proposed, and then I think that idea is very unique and then very original, because nobody actually argue the kind of aesthetic link between language and then the literature and the other art. That's why he actually focused on language, and very important. So in this sense, even though of course, as Lulu said, of course, and we didn't have such a unified and language system. What I mean, that kind of nationalism always presupposes the unification between oral language and written language, but that is simply project. That idea as such is invented. According to 𝗏𝗪, is invented by that representation regime of art. That means actually the art master described nature, is what the Karatani Gojin defined the landscape as a kind of invention of some sort of a modern the art or some modern literature. So that is what I mean. Actually, the representation regime invented this kind of new language model, but it wasn't really successful to unite the written language with the kind of actually the oral language. That means the oral language must be evicted from this writing system, and that is exactly the contradiction that 𝗏𝗪 pointed out. That contradiction as such is what the source of the literary politics. It doesn't mean just like Lee-Kwang-soo and Rizal. I think Rizal's position is, in my opinion, very ambiguous. He's the literature more like the aesthetic, the style. What I mean is not like the high modernism. It's not like that. He tried to write his novel in vernacular language. All right, even though actually it's Spanish, but anyway, it's a vernacular language. He tried to actually the take on. He tried to take on that kind of popular culture. Actually the writing style is a novel, that is thriller. Something like that. He actually took that kind of that style. It was very popular in Europe in those days. Of course, it might be different from the local language in Philippines. That means that he actually tried to write some kind of the secular novel, or he actually tried to write something in the vernacular style in Spanish sense, but for the the local people in Philippines in those days is a kind of some what I mean, actually, the kind of a certain, the language they could understand. That is what 𝗏𝗁𝗍 said, the inner, contradiction of literature. Novelists always write something for people, but those people, they mean local people, could understand, what actually this novelist wrote. This is actually problem of literature. It's a fundamental problem. That's what 𝗏𝗁𝗍 said. So in this sense, always, that kind of oral language and local language is isolated or alienated from literature. This is contradiction. But literatures tell us that, actually, the telos of literature is what? To embrace these people, or some create, to transform these people into another people. That is always happening. What is this? This is a typical doctrine of Maoism. So actually, the 𝗏𝗁𝗍's, the theory of literature quite, similar to, in my opinion, Maoist, the idea, imagination there, he brought up, because he was a Maoist, when he wrote, lots of book like this. And then, anyway, just he transformed the Maoism into some kind of aesthetic theory. That's why just the theory is very interesting. Anyway, in this sense, the contradiction is what? Some certain, the essential, feature of literature, in modern literature. And then, so even actually though the 𝗏𝗁𝗍, the classify the different regime and then periodization of, the different regime, but globalization, show that, these actually different regime coexist. It doesn't mean, the representation regime is, the rejected, the ethical regime, and then the aesthetic regime, the rejected, or some, the erased, the kind of the representation regime. It doesn't mean that. It's different regime coexist because of this kind of globalization. And then this is exactly what I mean, actually, revolutionary or some political aspect of literature as such. So in this sense, is oral, literature or oral, that some language is very important. And it cannot be reduced to the writing machine. And then it would be there. And then the purpose of literature is what? To, bring this, unrepresentable or irreducible language into its own, writing form. That is, in my opinion, the politics of literature.
So I think Dr. Lee told us that he has something else to do.
Dr. 𝗏
some other
also give me a question. In chat.
yes, yes.
Yeah. So
there's another question. Sorry.
I want to respond to Charlson, actually, the discussion.
I will read the question out first so that our viewers can hear it. So Dr. 𝗏 has a question for Alex. What are your thoughts about the relationship between literature and texts, scripts? As Charlson mentioned about the use of the kanji, the Han script has transformed in East Asia. Perhaps you can share about the case of South Korea, which has stopped using hanja. Has the notion of Korean literature changed after that shift? Right.
Great question. Yeah, that's what I mean. The Korea is quite obsessed, in modernization. And what they chose, that means they didn't, go to that kind of old regime of the letters. And they actually, the prohibited, using the hanja. And then they prohibited, using Chinese, and then what I mean, actually, Japanese, the language. It's right after, the liberation. It's all in the school started to teach, Korean. And then gradually transform the writing system. And then now that we use, the Hangul only, we have our own alphabet, like, the English alphabet. And then we actually, also the, Ministry of Education stopped, teaching hanja, the classical, the Chinese classic. We don't no longer, because my generation learned, that Chinese classic in school, but the young generation no longer. And then this, created, in my opinion, very interesting, the culture. so-called K-pop or some kind of K-wave. It's very strange in the culture. It's based on total, modernization. That means that actually the language, is totally actually the come along with this kind of oral language. That means that we try to, remove the kind of gap between the oral language and written language. This is Korean obsession, all right? And then, but in this sense, Korean culture is quite different became quite different from other, Asian countries, the case. What I mean, those countries still, influenced by Chinese, the culture, but Korea is no longer, actually young generation no longer, has that kind of the sentiment because of the language transformation, in my opinion. So 1990, after 1990, the policy changed, and then the all in newspaper and all actually, the public, the media stopped, showing this Chinese character, Before that, we put, some kind of the parallel, the parallel actually the letter when you actually put some Chinese the Chinese word, and then you must put the Chinese character, in parallel way. But after 1990 is the Ministry of Education changed policy, and then no longer, and then so young generation has no idea about Chinese character. And that's why actually it causes some very interesting happening. For instance, in Korean, we sometimes use, occasionally use Chinese the word. For instance, 금1, in Korean pronunciation, it means today. 금1, is today. But young generation cannot understand 금1. They thought 금1 is the Friday, because in Korean, the word is Friday means 금요일. But young generation thought, because they don't have any the idea of Chinese character. That's why they thought 금일 means 금요일. That's why huge the national confusion happening. So actually it still goes on. This kind of happening still goes on. So now that what happened in Korea, because of this kind of unification of the oral language and written language.
Yeah. So I think that was a very nice question from Dr. Sho, and I think we did learn a lot, and there's so many things that we want to ask, and so many things that we still want to discuss with Dr. Lee because of his very path-breaking discussion. But I think he told us that he has to go, and after Dr. Lee goes, then we will go to our next speaker. But before that, on behalf of the Institute of Creative Writing, 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝘁, we would like to thank Dr. Lee for participating in this year's Asian Literary Forum, and we wish you the a good experience in Barcelona. Also, maybe you can visit Jose Rizal's monument.
Yeah, of course, yes. Yeah, I saw that statue.
You already did.
My hotel is very close to the,
very close. Okay. Yeah, so there's almost like that Jose Rizal monument there. So
few people could, because one must master at least 4 languages in order to do that. You know, Malay, English, Chinese, Tamil, the 4 main literary languages in Malaysia. And there are, of course, many more other minority languages, such as Iban and Kadazan Dusun language, etc. And the person has to be able to read and research in all languages. Peace Writers Workshop in Manila in 1950, organized by NVM Gonzalez with the support of Rockefeller Foundation. And, you know, during that time, during the Cold War, and the US foundations, not just Rockefeller, but also Ford Foundation, Asia Foundation, and recently there are many Cold War studies who have kind of reviewed their relations, they came to Asia and Southeast Asia trying to kind of encourage writing, literary writing that is non-communist, to kind of promote the so-called thinking from the free world. And so Professor Wang was invited to join this workshop. And that's where that got him to think about the problem of language, because he wrote in English during that time. He's bilingual. He writes in both Chinese and English, but as a writer, he experiments with the language. And so he said, in Malaya, we were not talking about a Malayan literature, but about aspiring writers in English, finding new ways of expressing a local sensibility, using a bit of Malay, Cantonese, Hokkien in our own brand of English, which we call 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗃. This is the experiment of this young students, including himself, was legitimate, but that was not itself going to create a Malayan literature. So he found that because he in the workshop, he met fellow writers from Indonesia, from the Philippines, and there was one Indonesian writer who asked whether he knew of the Malay writers, Angkatan Sastrawan Asst 50 group that Dominic was referring to, the kind of leftist Malay writers group who espouse art for society's sake. And Wang Gengwu replied saying that he didn't know any one of them. So that left the Indonesian writer very unimpressed. So that is, so the writer was Rosihan Anwar, who translated Rizal into Indonesian, I believe. And so that's where he started to doubt, Professor Wang started to doubt about whether he is able to create national literature as a Malayan using the colonial tongue, and the nation, Malaya, was about to be decolonized, about to be independent. So he doubted about the futility of using a foreign language, which is English and Chinese, to express a new national identity. And he started to think about whether where do the Chinese in the region stand in the ferment of foreign nation building based on indigenous authenticity. So he said that Manila taught me what national literature might mean, but my loss of faith in my poetic skills began with the trip to Manila. So after that, he kind of switched to study history instead. He didn't want to be a writer anymore. He said he's not skillful enough to be a writer. So he started to study the overseas Chinese history. And then became the most important and significant scholar in this field today. And so this is an interesting story about Professor Wang Gengwu. And another renowned author, Han Soo-in, who spent 12 years in Malaya as a doctor, as writer, lecturer, and a vocal public intellectual. So Han Soo-in she is the best-selling author of A Many Splendid Thing, which was made into a movie. And in the 60s, she was styled herself as a spokesperson of Communist China to the West, right? She's often seen as somebody who straddles between the two worlds, the East and the West. So when she was in Malaya, in the late 50s and early 60s, she was teaching at Nanyang University, or we call Nanta, a Chinese medium university built in 1956 by local Chinese business leaders with significant contributions from the working class public of Malaya and Singapore. And this is Nanyang University, the iconic building. And this is where NTU Singapore today sits, Nanyang Technological University, but it's actually not the former Nanyang University, because it was kind of shut down by the government in the 80s and merged with the University of Singapore and became NUS today. So Nanyang University was a Chinese medium university in the 50s. And at that time, the students in Malaya, they were really enthusiastic about Afro-Asian solidarity, the Bandung Conference, and they even formed a group of Malayan delegates to participate in Bandung Student Conference in 1956. And so in Nanyang University, their founding vision was quite different compared to the University of Malaya, which was established by the British to nurture local elites. And Nanyang University was built solely by donations without any government subsidies. And so both students from both campuses, they were activists. There were many student activists, and they were inherently anti-colonial during that time. Although their activism focused on nation building, that kind of really espoused the Malayan identity, was quite different, imagined in quite different ways. And of course, in the wake of Malaya independence, the radicalism of Nanyang University students led to heavy crackdowns from the governments, and on the grounds that the students' involvement in the so-called communist subversive activities. So there were mass arrests, expulsions, banning of students' organizations and their publications. So when Han Soo-in was in Malaya, she was teaching at Nanta University. She encouraged the Chinese-speaking students to write in both Malay and English, and she promoted the use of Malay as the national language. And even though herself is an Anglophone writer, she writes in English exclusively. So Nanta students, they also champion the inclusivity of using Malay language as the new national language of Malaya. And they experiment with Malayanization through translation. So there were a big group of Nanta translator translating between Chinese and Malay, trying to so in the sense of nationalism, as we were talking about. So these are some examples of their publications, and as you can see, this is their student organ. They were published in 3 languages: Chinese, English, and Malay. And the Chinese students also published literary magazines in Malay, and this is in 3 languages. So for Han Soo-in and many students in Nanyang University, they view Malay as a language that connects the polyglot society, the multilingual society, but also believe that the development of culture and literature written in other languages for example, in Chinese and English and Tamil, should be celebrated. But they nominated Malay rather than English as the national language. It was a conscious decolonial act. So Malay was also seen as a language of liberation for the anti-colonial movement. So the act of translation itself by the students and also by championing Malay language, they see the language as vehicle of nationalism. But however, despite the multilingual reality in Malaya, including Singapore, the colonial and post-colonial state was really anxious about the linguistic diversity in Malaya. So as historian Rachel Liao said, so language diversity has appeared to the state as something to be managed and mourn as a terrible confusion and a source of crisis, rather than something to be praised and as a source of connection, human creativity, and alternative modes of being national. And this is because there may be, in the basic nature of modern state, a propensity to react in this way to diversity, to regard it as a crisis rather than opportunity. So this is when we talk about national literature, a national language, a national culture. So actually in Malaya, it was seen as a crisis that has to be managed, especially how do we have a common language for people to be able to communicate, right? And one thing that changed the entire political and cultural atmosphere that I was talking about in the 50s and 60s, when all these students, they were so there were student activism and students themselves want to learn Malay. A Chinese student learned Malay, and there were all sort of translation ongoing. One thing that changed the atmosphere was the May 13 racial riot in 1969. That happened after the general election in Malaysia, when the opposition party won many seats and denied the government 2/3 majority in parliament. So the documents of the riots are still classified, so it's still kind of a mystery. So nobody know what it was really about, and the death toll was said to be 196. This is by government record, but many people believe that it was over thousands. And recent years, they started to have many grassroots efforts to recover that history through oral histories, and writers write about the event in fiction, for example, but we still don't know the so-called the truth in the racial riot. So, but what this is still a taboo topic, and oftentimes politicians will warn people that May 13 will happen again if the political status quo was challenged. So, despite that, in 2018 we have a government change. A regime change for the first time since independence. May 13 is still something that nobody kind of dared to touch upon. So, but it is the policy that followed the racial riot that changed Malaysia, that defined the new Malaysia. So we can see from a quote from the writer 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗹, a poet. She said, after May 13, thousands of Malaysians like myself withdrew into mass depression. I had no nationalist idealism to imagine. The cultural parochialism that took shape in the aftermath of the riots in Malaysia, which includes race-based quotas, communalist politics, and separatist race essentialist cultures, was absolute anathema to me. And the policy that she mentioned about was in particular the national culture policies in 1971. And so there were three main points. This is the first point. The national culture must be based on the indigenous culture of this region, which is really legit. And this region covers Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So actually, writings in Filipinos, I was really happy to see that could also be included in our discussion of national culture in Malaysia. So basically, the use of Malay language is essential. It's what kind of formed the national culture. And the second point of the policy is that suitable elements from the other culture may be accepted as part of the national culture. So these other cultures includes, cultural elements of the Chinese, Indians, Arabs, Westerners, and others. They, which are considered suitable and acceptable, they will be included in national culture. But we don't know who gets to define what is suitable and acceptable. But such acceptance must be in accordance with the principle of Rukun Negara, the national principles, as well as national interests, moral values, and position of Islam as the official religion of the country. Because the third point highlights the importance of Islam as a component in the formulation of the national culture, which is the religion. So as we can see, the nature of the Malay language has significantly changed as stipulated in the National Culture Policy by the government in 1971. It is kind of meant to exclude the so-called other cultures, especially Chinese, Tamil, and English, the three other literary languages that are being used in Malaysia. And it is said to be a decolonial act as well, but maybe on the other side, which is to return to essentialism and to be exclusivist. And but they try to define national literature and national culture to be a literature that to be written only in Malay, and actually they kind of also inherently mean it has to be written by ethnic Malays. As we can see, the national laureate today, all of them are ethnic Malay, and they write in Malay language. And the role of the Institute of Language and Literature, we call them DBP, Dewan Bahasa dan Sastra, Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka, is to standardize and police the Malay language. And their mission is to protect the national language and to set the authority of the language. So national cultural policy was created to show that, in fact, how a bureaucratic and exclusivist definition of a national culture has really undermined our diversity. And a lot of artists and writers in these days have tried to subvert it. And in fact, the Malay culture itself, this is 50 years, more than 50 years after the national culture policy. If we revisit it today, we can see that Malay culture itself is actually the greatest victim of the policy, because it carries the burden of becoming a national culture at the expense of eliminating its own heterogeneity. So they are trying to define what is not Malay culture. So a lot of the hybrid culture of the Malay culture itself is being excluded by the policy. So the policy has not built a so-called national culture, but in fact a culture of resentment, that people start to have these boundaries. And that's why that's what I mentioned in the first place. This writers and critics in these different linguistic realms, linguistic spheres, they don't even cross path. We don't even have a platform to cross path, and at least not in the not under the state organization. So the question I have is, how relevant is national literature today? Is the concept still relevant? If it is, how so, and how are we going to make it more inclusive? So in the past decade, when social movement was really strong in Malaysia, we saw the rise of independent publishers, and there are cultural activist groups who want to challenge the hegemonic nature of the Malay language stipulated by Dewan Bahasa. Right? They want to repoliticize Malay language as the language for the mass, for the people. So one publisher, Buku Fiksi, also a bookstore, they publish so-called pulp fiction, popular literature, but also serious literature too, in various of its imprints. And they also translated work into English and into Malay, and they did a lot of good things that DBP, the Dewan Bahasa, won't do. So for young writers, young Malay writers in particular, who want to be recognized and be taken seriously by by people, publishing with DBP in fact wasn't the best option for them, and for many it was the last thing that they want to do, because they would be seen as being conservative, right? So they want to publish with this really cool publisher like Buku Visi. And on the other hand, when people search Malaysian writer on Google, the first writers that will come out is Tan Tuan Eng, the famous Anglophone writers based in South Africa, but he's Malaysian, and he wrote he's won international Booker. No, he was longlisted for Booker's Prize, and he is the first Malaysian International Booker Prize judge this year. He just published a novel this year, and also other writers who write in English and based overseas. And this writer 𝗩𝗲𝘁𝗃, who is Taiwan-based writer but born in Sarawak, he writes in Chinese language, and just won the Newman Prize this year, which was a big award in Chinese literature, because Mo Yan, the Nobel Prize winner, was the former winner of this award. So this 𝗩𝗲𝘁𝗃 is a Malaysian-born writer based in Taiwan. He's a naturalized Taiwanese citizen right now, and he writes his novels are all exclusively about Sarawak, about the rainforest, about Malaysia, and really really great writing. I also like his work. And so if we look at this, when we talk about Malaysian literature, the things that comes to people's mind are actually writers based overseas, and not the writers that based in Malaysia and write in Malay. So in fact, the trend is developing in the direction opposite to what the state desire, which is a conundrum, right? Which is quite an irony, actually. The state did try to promote national culture, national literature through the Malay language, but right now the trend is developing in the opposite direction. And contemporary writers, they are most recognized within Malaysia and globally, are not writing in Malay. And also, but this also shows that English and Chinese, they are not minority language at all at the global level, but Malay is the minority language at the global level. So because there are many critics in Malaysia who will of course lament the use of English and Chinese not being recognized by the state, so they use the lens of minority language to describe the works right in Chinese and English. But in fact, these are not minority language if we look at the global scale. So my kind of last point is my last slide. It's translation. So why is translation important? Because I think it's really important for Malaysia. As I said, we are really separated by different linguistics realms, different languages that if it's not translation within and across, we wouldn't be able to understand each other, not to mention that to communicate and to create a national literature together, collectively, right? And the idea of translation, literary translation, is I see that there are two purposes usually, which is most commonly understood as an international endeavor. First is to introduce foreign authors to the local community. So we translate foreign authors into our own local language. The second purpose is to introduce our authors from within, from non-Western tradition to the global, often English reading public, which is to translate out, right? Translate in and translate out. But translation in Malaysia and Singapore, I would say, kind of differs because it needs to take place both across and within. We have to translate within first in order to kind of understand each other in a national sense. So that's why literary translation between languages in Malaysia becomes a conscious act, if not a political effort, to let one another to be heard within the national context, right? So the Nanta generation, the Nanyang University generation, the Chinese Malay translator, they did this in the spirit of third world solidarity, of anti-colonialism. They translate Chinese into Malay and Malay into Chinese by bypassing English, the colonial language, which is quite significant, I think, because the challenge we have today is because English is always the pivot language in literary and non-literary translation at national, regional, and global scales. So Singapore's political elites will see English as the so-called neutral language without any racial connotation. So no race can claim that the nation favors any particular race. So they all use English, right? Even though Malay is Singapore's national language, many contemporary Singaporeans, they don't speak their national language at all. They don't write in their national language, which is also an irony, but use English, right? So, but we know that the colonial language, English, can never be neutral, as what the Singapore government would say. So English is the pivot language among Asian literature too. So literary works need to be translated into English first, and then from English to other languages. And it also, by translating into English, it also makes exposure to the global market possible. So people want to be translated into English in order to be seen by the world. And within Asia as well. So the case of Chinese Malay translation, I think, shows that they bypass English and translate between the language of the third world, which is something significant. But at the same time, we have to kind of know that they have at the market value, they have less value compared to translation into English, right? Today, when we talk about Southeast Asian literature in translation, most of the time we are talking about the Malay, Indonesian, Tagalog words translated into English because they are being seen. The global language is the English language, right? So this is something that I think we have in the problem that we have encountered, and it's a common problem that we need to overcome. And this is Georgetown Literary Festival that happened a few days ago, actually in 26 in Penang, in Malaysia, which is a good initiative that they try to do things that 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗹 don't do, right? And the Buku 𝗩𝗶𝘀, they also translated Tamil. This year they translated the Tamil novel written by a Malaysian Tamil language writer into Malay. And this is said to be the first kind of commercially published translated work from Tamil to Malay. And they also published a few books in English and Malay as well. And so I think this is something I want to throw out for discussion, the role of translation. And really last slide, it's just 𝗩𝗶𝘀 mentioned about my work, Malay Sketches, is I translate from English to Chinese. Although the title is Malay Sketches, the writer writes in English. He's a Malay Singaporean, but there are also many untranslated Malay terms in his English. So he said, the writer himself said that he translated Malay into English when he's writing the novel himself. So he has to foreignize or domesticate the Malay words into English. So I translated it into Chinese for publication in Taiwan because it was the Taiwan publisher that commissioned me to do it. And then last year it was published in simplified Chinese in China by a friend. So because the thing that my translation did not happen in Malaysia or in Singapore also state the fact that we don't do it at all we don't do it enough in Malaysia and Singapore. And we have to really rely on this transnational effort, which is not a bad thing as well, to do that. But my audience in mind when I translated this book is to let the Chinese-speaking public in Malaysia and Singapore to know this book. But my audience in mind is actually not really Taiwanese or mainland Chinese readers. So we can talk more about that later. I think I will end my presentation here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shou, for that very interesting and very relevant lecture also for the Philippine experience. And maybe this time we can start with the reaction from 𝗏𝗀𝗃.
Oh, that's a surprise. No, no, but thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shou. That's very, very relevant actually to the Philippine experience. And I actually think Sir Charlson, I think, will have a lot to say because he has a lot of experience on these matters, very personal experience on the kinds of problems we have with language, problems we have with issues of nation and regionalization and region and matters like that. I guess for my response, there were a lot of. So first, I guess I just want to say there was really a lot that I thought was that really struck me when I was reading, both when I was listening to your presentation and when I was reading your work as well. I was struck, for example, by the description of the Malay studies and the different projects in Nanta, and basically, I guess the difference of the I suppose the political movements in the 50s and the 60s. It's relating back to I think a common thing also in many Southeast Asian countries. In the 50s to 60s was the projects then were there were very vital, very vibrant projects then that would often be cut out or debilitated moving forward. The experience in the 60s, especially in countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, with the rise of political violence and dictatorships there. I was very struck, although I think out of everything, I was most struck by this notion of, I guess, I was reading this I looked at this based on the essay you had in New Mandala on this revitalizing the vernacular, that idea of revitalizing the vernacular. I was struck by it, I think, because of, I suppose it's because the way it was framed, at least from what I understood, it seemed like the way it was framed when you were thinking about it in the case of Malaysia, and I guess Singapore, was you have these large official languages, national languages that become rigid, that become stiff, to use the contrary term of revitalization, that become kind of dead in a sense, or become very calcified because of the way it's treated in those countries. And so the project, from what I understood, you were saying, the project, especially of Translation Within, would involve a capacity to bring a certain life back into all the vernaculars, in part by translating between them. The goal being, I guess, to give life to the local languages themselves, and because of the connection between language and community, identity, all of these things, in a sense, to give life to the literary community as a whole and to the people as a whole through the revitalization of the vernacular. I was imagining it as, I suppose, from what I understood, almost like to use a kind of a funny term, perhaps. The idea would be a project of, let's say, permanent vernacularization, where you never allow something to calcify, you never allow the language to be, to ever fully be captured by, let's say, the state, for example. I mean, tying it back to what we discussed, I suppose, with Dr. Lee's talk, right, in terms of when they are talking about, or what Sir Charlson was mentioning there, in terms of when the state steps in and things start changing, and in connection with the Dewan Bahasa. There will be these attempts to give national laureates, national artist awards, to kind of reconfigure certain figures like Jose Rizal, like Lucian, like all of these figures into a state ideology of some sort, but then and to do that to the language as well. But with this constant translation process, perhaps you will prevent that from happening. I think that's what I understood from your project, and I thought it's an amazing idea. I was thinking about it in the context of the Philippines. I suppose for a number of reasons. So our case is, so I also, just to give some context, I also teach Maritime Southeast Asian literature in UP every now and then, every a few semesters. And it always strikes students as very interesting is the ways in which our countries are all the same but all very different. In many ways, the Philippines is much more similar as opposed to Indonesia in some of its political developments and its history. But definitely, especially in terms of issues with language, there are a lot of funny both parallels and reversals. So we are also, English language is very dominant also in the Philippines in a number of ways. It's still there. Unlike in Malaysia, it is an official language here, like officially so. And in a sense, English is in many ways more powerful to the detriment of a lot of things like the educational system. English is in power. And that has, because of that, there was a long history of, and this is the kind of thing I think Sir Charlson will talk about in much better detail. But there's a lot of tension over the generations, or discussions and debates over the generations between the questions of if you're going to create a national culture, you're going to create a national literature, to what extent, for example, well, first, to what extent can English be used for that? Second, to what extent is it, even if it could be used for that, perhaps, to what extent would it be better to use one of the local languages, or especially the national language, officially Filipino? Although at the same time, to what extent is Filipino truly inclusive and national? That is also something in debate, or it's in a project, because the idea Filipino is basically based on, originally on Tagalog, the language of, let's say, the largest group, with the idea that it would evolve over time. And it has evolved somewhat, but it is still primarily Tagalog based. And so there's this project of inclusivity with the language, that the language is supposed to grow and evolve. And then there are tensions and questions as to what extent it has, to what extent it hasn't, to what extent it hasn't because it's been debilitated by, for example, the fact that English is still very dominant. And then, of course, there's still the tension amongst the different ethnic groups. And so there's a lot of, there are a lot of issues, a lot of questions with language. And then actually in the last few years, I think, unlike Malaysia, where the non-Malay languages are being, let's say, marginalized, in the case of the Philippines, it would be Filipino, even Filipino itself is increasingly under threat in the last few years. It is widespreadly used throughout the country, but in terms of, let's say, government usage, business usage, and even just its place in the educational system, it's increasingly under threat. So it just leads to this very complicated business with regard to, when we go to literature, for example, with regard to the question of to what extent literature, Philippine literature, is alive for the Filipino people. How many people read any kind of Philippine literature in whatever language, whether it's English, whether it's in Filipino, whether it's in any of the local languages. To what extent are the languages in that sense alive for the people, right? And to what extent have they become debilitated, have they calcified because of these tensions, the language, and which languages are institutionalized, which are not. So yeah, I think there's really a lot that's relevant with regards to the ideas you brought up here in the Philippines. And I guess there's one last thing to bring up that I was thinking of, just in line with this idea of this like revitalization of the vernacular. I was thinking of how, so hypothetically, if English supposedly, right, would still be, there is a possibility for it to be, let's say, localized, nationalized, indigenized. The usual discussion for that, right, in the academia would be questions of world Englishes, the transformation of English in the post-colonial world. And I was thinking it's in line with that idea. I was thinking it's quite, to me, it sounds like what you're doing, or some of the ideas you're talking about, also involves, in a sense, the transformation of these non-English languages, the transformation of the vernaculars through contact with one another. If it's English, usually the discussion is English is transforming in its contact with the post-colonial societies and it's becoming world Englishes and all of these things. Well, in a country like Malaysia, for example, especially if this translation within project continues, then Malay is transforming, Malaysian Chinese is transforming, Tamil is transforming, Malaysian English is transforming. They're all transforming also because they're in contact with one another, ideally with this constant translation within, so that it's true contact, it's living contact, right? As opposed to the, let's say, institutional calcification and stuff like that. So yeah, so that's just ideas that were flowing in my head. But yeah, very, very amazing vibrant talk. So thank you for sharing this.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. That's really, the talk is really amazing. So now I think we go to Charlson. I think we will say a lot of things too, as Dom said.
Yeah. Well, congratulations, Doctor. Actually, there is the Muslim, Wang, and into English, and then Joaquin translated into Filipino. So there are these projects, small scale, small volume. towards a later Malay kind of ethos. So far, that's my reaction. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Charlson. Yingxin, it's so interesting that I didn't really intend it, but our two reactors are both Chinese Filipino. They're Chinoy, and Charlson is mainly writes in English. Dom also knows Bahasa Indonesia, and also translates from Bahasa Indonesia into English or Filipino. So they're quite an interesting group here. And and also I have so many things that I have to think about because of your lecture. But one thing I also want to ask you is, you translated Malay sketches, which is a which you describe as a kind of the writer describes as he's kind of translating from Malay into English while he was writing it, and then you translated it into Chinese, into some kind of Chinese that would be understood by Taiwanese, right? And then so that it would be published in traditional Chinese characters, and then it was published in simplified Chinese characters in the mainland. Would there be a similar process of, trying to adjust it so that Malaysian Chinese would be able to, or Singaporean Chinese would be able to read it? Would there be some kind of different way of rewriting it also for that kind of audience in Singapore and Malaysia, for the Chinese readers there? Also, I had this thought cross my mind while Charlson was talking, because a lot of I think, for example, the Maning Miklat Award, Miklat grew up in China because her parents were involved in the Cultural Revolution and in China, and there was a lot of connection among Chinese here with mainland China, whereas you speak of connections with Taiwan, right, in Malaysia and Taiwan. So I think that's one interesting inflection also, though I am aware of certain Filipino-Taiwan connections, but I'm more familiar with Filipino mainland connections. So and in your writing, in your essays, you mentioned that for Malaysian Chinese, it was easier to go to Taiwan than to go to the mainland for study, for other purposes. So there are these kinds of differences that we can also take note of. Yeah, but this would be this is a great conversation between you three about these issues in the Philippines and in Malaysia. Maybe you have some kind of reply or response.
Yeah. So maybe I can just briefly respond to our two reactors. Thank you so much for the reflections. Really, it kept me thinking a lot. And maybe I will kind of address what Dominic was talking about, the permanent vernacularization, which is a really kind of radical movement. I think I'm all for it. And if we were to do it, and of course the idea of transformation of language within Malaysia, the idea of not only English has been transformed, but other languages have also been transformed in the process. I think that's happening, and this is also a response to �ស៊𝗻's question about my audience in Singapore and Malaysia, that my readers who read Chinese. So basically, the situation is that I studied in Taiwan for my first degree because I'm a graduate of Chinese medium high school in Malaysia, and my certificate is not recognized by the public university, so I cannot enter a public university, and Taiwan was the cheapest option, not being able to go to Australia or the UK. So we were seen as overseas Chinese students, 𝗪生in Taiwan. Republic of China still see us as part of the overseas Chinese students, and so we actually the Chinese readers in Malaysia and Singapore understand both traditional and simplified characters. We can read both characters. And so it's not a problem that for us to, not being able to read one of those. So, but for Taiwanese friends, my Taiwanese friend, they don't understand. A lot of them can't really understand some of the simplified characters because it's too simplified for them. And they say it doesn't make sense to them. So for us, we understand. So, and we read a lot of imported books from Taiwan and China. So basically we know the standard Chinese, but the vernacular language they were talking about, the so-called Sinophone language in everyday life, it's different. And I pointed out one example in the essay that in Malaysia we use, for example, I translate lorry into just lorry because that's how we say it in Malaysia. It's just lorry, it's lorry, or taxi is just 的士. But Taiwanese and mainland Chinese, they have different usage of the term. So it's more standard, like metered vehicle, 计程车 in Taiwan. So, but we understand what 计程车 means, but it's just not how we use it in Malaysia. So because of the fact that it is published in Taiwan, I have to use 计程车 instead of taxi. So that's some compromise between me and the editor, and I have to do that. But I think in terms of understanding, we won't have any issues. But I really sincerely hope that I can do a kind of a localized version. But there isn't any publisher who will be interested in doing that actually. So because we rely too much on imported books from China. And yeah, this is one thing. The other thing about the Malay language, yeah, so I think it's really interesting that Dominic mentioned Filipino language being Tagalog based. I'm not too sure about the dynamics in it because I assume that Filipino is being championed as the national language. So it's not just based on one single language, but like it should be nationalized. And I think similar things happens in Indonesia. So nobody can claim that Indonesian language belong to just one ethnic group. But so in the 20s, the Indonesian people say, during 𝗩𝗶𝗶𝗶 Pemuda, the youth pledge. So they pledge for Indonesian language to be the language of Indonesia. So they call it Indonesia, but it's the Malay language, right? It's the lingua franca. But the case is different in Malaysia because the Malay language it's both a national language and also a racialized language, a language so-called belong to the Malay race. So there is some conundrum in that. So for example, today Malay language is so politicized that every time when for example, in this kind of public talk, when it is not run in Malay language, there will be kind of nativist sense that it should be in Malay language, but not in English or other language, because Malay is the national language. And my friends will joke that of course, we are able to speak in Malay, and but one of my friends will say that he kind of refused to fall into that trap, the national language trap, by saying that I'm happy to just use Indonesian to it's the same language anyway. So he's more willing to speak Indonesian than Malay to the fellow Malay so-called nativists, because he see that Indonesian language is more equal and egalitarian in that sense, even though it's the so-called same language. So I think, yeah, it's the problem of politicization of language. As for Charlson's question about the future, I don't see that we have, it's actually very optimistic. I don't see that, because if we want to look for one Chinese Malay translator in Malaysia, in the 50 and 60, maybe we can find a couple or a dozen, quite some of them who can do Chinese to Malay translation. But today in Malaysia, it's hard to find one who can do literary, especially literary Chinese to Malay translation, because my generation's especially like myself, who went to Chinese medium schools, a lot of my classmates, we can't say that we are able to translate into Malay, even though we of course learn Malay in schools. So it is really, really hard. And yeah, I think of course we need more people who are able to kind of juggle these different languages, but oftentimes it's really challenging. I myself try to write in Malay and translate Malay into Chinese and Chinese into Malay, but oftentimes one writer, one translator, there is always a kind of a dominant a language that you feel more kind of belong to, or so I can't be everyone. That's just a brief response. I hope it makes sense.
Thank you, Yingxin, for the replies to our reactors and to the questions. I'll ask if there are questions from the online viewers. Do we have any questions? I don't think we have any questions yet. So I was thinking also about the solutions that we might have for these very similar problems that we have in Philippines and in Malaysia. And I was thinking about Dom's idea of the permanent vernacularization. I think that's a good concept, and maybe it can be further pursued. So I think we can learn a lot from Dr. Show's writings, other writings about these problems in Malaysia, that we can actually think of our own issues more deeply in the Philippines. In fact, I taught a graduate class, I think a few semesters ago, and it was about national literature. And then after discussing this concept for at length, right? My student said, we don't agree with that concept of national literature anymore. So nobody agreed with it anymore, with the concept after our whole semester of discussing it. So it was such a difficult topic to discuss and to try to try to bring all of the threads together of this kind of very strange and complex object of multilingual societies that we have in our different countries. So maybe Charlson would like to say something else, or Dom, maybe they want to follow up something before we look for other questions. Charlson?
Well, you mentioned actually the booming is hiring a lot of local paramedics. So
Yes.
serve in rural
Yes.
hospitals.
Thanks, Charlson. I think there's a lot of stories here, and we can recommend. I will recommend your novels to Dr. Show, so that maybe you can find a way to send them to her, so that she will have a deeper grasp of what you've been talking about for in this very short session. And I think Dr. Show already has something to do at the moment, and I would like now to I think we have to cut short our discussion at the moment, although we still have a lot of things to say. And I would like to express to Dr. Show the thanks of the Institute of Creative Writing Center of UP Diliman for participating in this year's Asian Literary Forum. And hopefully we will meet again next year. There will be conferences, there will be other venues to further discuss these very important matters. So I think today we learned a lot from Dr. Lee and from Dr. Show, and I think that we can continue further these discussions. And I think these will have a lot of implications and produce I think actual practical results in terms of facing our issues in terms of literature, language, and society in all of our countries. So thank you very much, Xin, Dr. Show. Thank you very much for gracing us with your presence and for your wonderful talk. I give a hand for Dr. Show. Yeah. So I think thank you very much to our audience, and thank you to our reactors, to our wonderful reactors, and to our staff at ICW. So we will be having we'll be continuing this series of Asian Literary Forum on a yearly basis. I think it's so interesting to continue, not even just on a yearly basis, but on a more frequent basis. But we will still see each other with the Asian Literary Forum next year. So thank you very much to all our viewers, to our listeners, and if you have further questions, please communicate with us, and we can bring you in touch with our speakers. Thank you very much. Charlson, thank you very much.